Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today, in this, the 8th episode of A View from Afar for 2023, political scientist Dr. Paul Buchanan and I will examine the risks of a 21st century nuclear war. In particular, we're going to look at the movie Oppenheimer, well, not so much the movie, but how renewed interest in the dawn of the nuclear era has occurred as a consequence of that movie. I'm going to put the question here, and are we safer now from nuclear war than we were in the years immediately after 1945? The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved its Doomsday Clock hand to 90 seconds before midnight. Now that's the highest threat level since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what does that say about contemporary international security affairs? No nuclear arms limitation agreements have been signed in over a decade. Several have lapsed, and most nuclear-armed countries are not signatories to them anyway. Countries like China are rapidly expanding their arsenals, and others like North Korea, Iran, and others are seeking to join the nuclear-armed club. Has nuclear arms control failed? What is the future of Non-Proliferation Treaty? Although conventions against the use of chemical and biological weapons are widely recognised, violations of the prohibitions have occurred regularly, most recently in Syria, and weapons like white phosphorus, cluster munitions continue to be used by many states. Now, these questions today will include, has nuclear and non-nuclear arms control failed as well? As Russia's Vladimir Putin's regime has threatened to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine and NATO. Is the nuclear genie about to come out of the bottle, even at a tactical level, at a tactical nuke level? Are we seeing the return of weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs? Are we on the brink of an Oppenheimer's nightmare, nuclear Armageddon? And importantly, what are the solutions to this most serious and dangerous threat? I just want to thank Paul for his notes that have contributed significantly to that introduction. Before we cross to Paul, there's an invitation to our live audiences. Now, feel free to interact with you while you are live with us and while we're recording this podcast live. YouTube is our preference because we're able to see your interaction very, very quickly, and sometimes Facebook has its issues. Remember, if you do make comments or lodge questions, your interaction may be included in this broadcast. Okay, so we're all set now. So let's cross to Paul, who's waiting online to dig down deep into these major, serious issues. Kia ora, Paul. Tēnā koe e hoa. How are you this morning, Paul?
I'm good. Kia ora, and welcome to the listeners out there. Yeah, that was a good intro, Selwyn, because I guess our listeners need to understand that you and I, back and forth in the days before we do these shows, and because we live on different sides of the North Island of New Zealand, We do it a lot by email. Sometimes we do these video conferences in advance, but you put out the questions very well. And if you don't mind indulging me, I'd like to start out my commentary with an anecdote, a personal anecdote that shows my indirect connection to the Manhattan Project. I'm well aware of Oppenheimer before the movie. I have not seen the movie yet. But in any event, I thought our listeners would be interested in this connection because it will also talk about my personal interest in
I think
all
it's highly
things
relevant.
nuclear.
Yeah, very relevant, I think.
Yeah,
Very,
yeah. Well, I'll say this: what gave me the idea of coming at it from this angle is in the last week, there's obviously been a lot of fanfare about the movie, but also on Sunday is the 78th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And 3 or 4 days ago, Prime Minister Medvedev, of Russia threatened to use strategic nukes in the event that the Russians were pushed back and or the Ukrainians wanted to seize Crimea. Now, he may have misspoken when he said strategic nukes.
yeah, because that's big.
He may have,
Perhaps the audience, just for some that don't follow this, just can you explain the difference between the strategic and tactical nuke on that?
sure, sure. Well, strategic nukes are the big bombs that come out of missile silos, out of submarines, and are targeted, as we've talked about, in the past. They no longer really target urban centers because the accuracies of these missiles are now so good that you can target hardened military infrastructure. But they're the ones that have the megaton bombs, the really big bombs on the top of them, and they're launched by intercontinental strategic missiles, be it from submarines or from land based silos. Theater nukes are nukes, and we'll talk about that in a second, are nukes that can be launched anywhere from 550 kilometers to 1,500 kilometers away. So these are the nukes that are looking at each other in Europe. The Russians have their theater nukes, and again, we'll talk about this. And of course, the NATO has their nukes, mostly in the possession of the United States, but also the UK and France have their own nuclear arsenals, both strategic and theater. And then tactical nukes are battlefield nukes, artillery shells, air-launched cruise missiles, and they have smaller warheads. The idea is to kill the opponent on the battlefield, but not turn this into, a strategic conflagration. So there's three levels right now: tactical to theater to strategic. Strategists will tell you this gives you more layers of deterrence because you can go up the escalatory chain, but not get to strategic nuclear exchanges that could obliterate large parts of the world. Now, I'm not going to get into the technical stuff. You and I have talked about this, MERVs and MARVs, and we've done that before. I'm actually thinking more along the political lines, and the ultimate focus of the show is about international norms and international norms violation when it comes to nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. So we'll go there, but let me tell you my story because it illustrates a lot of
Yes,
this.
and thanks for giving that backstory to what the nuclear the three levels of nuclear consideration are. I think it's
Hmm.
very important. Thanks.
Yeah, and the idea, I mean, just to finish that thought, is you try to deter the enemy at each level. So, you say, oh, don't dare use tactical nukes on the battlefield because then we can use them on you.
Yeah,
Don't
and this is
dare use.
in the New Zealand context. This is exactly where David Longy and others were arguing on deterrence, that it's cannot be assured, and that
Right.
at that time, and quite clearly the question was put at Oxford in the famous debate there with David Longy said where he was speaking from nuclear weapons are morally indefensible, and deterrence was picked apart on that point. So this is where we've talked in the past as well, isn't
Yeah.
it, Paul? I'll hand it back to you.
Okay. So, and when I decided to go to the University of Chicago, I went there because at that time, They were probably the number one department in international relations. They had the father of realism, Hans Morgenthau. They had the father of international systems theory, Morton Kaplan. They had this brilliant nuclear strategist present at the Manhattan Project by the name of Albert Wohlstetter. And I wanted to study under all three of them, so I went and I did. Uh, Wohlstetter was an interesting character, to say the least. Basically, what he told us was in the 40s, he went into let's say a murky area in the U.S. war effort. I think he worked for something called the Department of Military Procurement, which essentially, among other things, was building the nuclear weapon. And he told us a number of things that were interesting. We have to remember that Chicago is where the first nuclear reactor was built. A physicist by the name of Enrico Fermi in 1936 built the first atomic reactor in the basement of one of the science buildings on the main quad of the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago is sort of modeled on Oxford in terms of the quadrangles and what have you. Anyway, they built this thing in the basement, got atoms to collide against each other, and there you go, had the first chain reaction, 1936. Anyway, they and another fellow by the name of Edward Teller, who was Oppenheimer's lieutenant in the Manhattan Project, he was also a physicist working for Fermi at Chicago at the time the war broke out. So you see the Chicago connection to the Manhattan Project was intimate, not strong, intimate. Um, Wohlstetter was part of that. And in the seminars that he gave to his grad students, he explained two things. Well, he explained a lot more than that, but he said, first of all, he was one of the targeters for the bombing raids. And the original bombs, of course, were not destined for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which didn't have a lot of military value. They were going to go after, I believe, Yokohama and not Tokyo. They wanted to negotiate with Kobe. But cloud cover prevented them from reaching those targets, so they diverted to the secondary targets, which is Hiroshima on August the 6th, 1945, and then Nagasaki on August the 9th, 1945. Now, what's interesting about that is the Trinity test, the first nuclear explosion, was conducted in the White Sands testing range near Alamogordo, New Mexico, in mid-July 1945, where they put a ball, basically a cylinder, with fissile material and blew it up. And that's the famous big explosion, and everybody, sitting there going, whoa, that's a little bigger than we expected. What happened then is very interesting. Oppenheimer was so impressed with the power of this explosion. This is after the Trinity test, that he brought his team together. And it included Edward Teller. It may have included Wohlstetter as a junior officer. There's some murkiness about whether he was in the Air Force or the OSS or something. But nevertheless, they sat down and they said, we can't make the call on whether to use these bombs or stage a demonstration to the Japanese so that they understood what was coming their way. Oppenheimer, as the team leader, said, we as scientists can't make the call. And we don't want the military to make the call because they're going to say, yes, let's go with the bombing. Let's get this war over with. So let's pitch it to the political leaders in Washington, D.C. It's a political decision to use this weapon to end the war. It's not a military decision. So it turns out Oppenheimer was doing a back channel to the White House at the time, and that alienated him from Teller and others. But the word came back from the political leaders. Okay, we've got two options in front of us, and this is what Wohlstetter was telling the seminar. We tell the Japanese to look out over Tokyo Bay on midnight, August the 1st. And at midnight, there will be an explosion like no other in the sky. That's the weapon that's coming your way, in the near future. You guys see this? Think about it and surrender. Uh, the scientists, when asked by the military people if they could guarantee that the demonstration would be successful, they said no. We've never dropped it out of an airplane. We don't know what's going to happen. And so the military and political leadership said, well, the last thing we want to do is tell the Japanese to go look up at the sky and nothing happens, right? Then now we're in for another hard slog. So let's go with the bombing. Forget the demonstration because we don't know if it's going to go off. What's the worst can happen? If you try to do the bombing raid, you're only dropping one bomb, and if it falls to the ground and rolls around, the Japanese will be perplexed, but nothing happened, right? It'll take a while for them to figure it out, and you'll follow up with other strikes. That was why they went with the bombing, and then they had to divert from the military significant targets. Well, guess what? At 5,000 feet above Hiroshima, the bomb did go off. And the results, of course, are changed history forever. Now, what's interesting?
So just to be clear, that call was made by the President of the United States at the time.
Yes. It was a political decision by at that time it was Truman to use it to end the war. I mean, the justification, the moral, ethical justification was, use it to end the war. A lot less lives will be lost than having to fight the Japanese for another year. And make of that what you will. Now, what's interesting is Oppenheimer was so appalled by what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that he turned against the weapons program and became an avid anti-nuclear activist.
How long did it take him to get to that tipping point? Was it immediate when he saw?
Apparently the movie alludes to this, that he had a lot of misgivings because he was asked, what's going to happen when this thing goes off at the top of the tower? And he was torn between, well, there's going to be a really big, the equivalent to 1 million tons of TNT, or we might suck the air out of the atmosphere, and that's the end of us. Blow a hole in the atmosphere and we're done. He really didn't know because he was operating on theoretical models. So he saw what happened. He paused. He said, well, it's political, which I actually think was the correct decision to make. But then he saw the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that was it for him. Oppenheimer turned 180 degrees and became an activist to the point that he was stripped of his security clearances and was subject to the Joe McCarthy House Un-American Committee investigations because apparently, he might be a bit of a turncoat.
I'll just make a quick parallel on this. Be very quick, but it's interesting because significant people, it seems like they get to a situation often from within the nuclear, how do we put it, the nuclear response kind of fraternity. And what I'll do is I'll just cite an individual here, Robert Greene, commander in the British Royal Navy. He was in charge of Buccaneer strike groups. Their target was Leningrad during the Cold War. The Buccaneers, they'd come along, and in interviews I did with Robert Greene, they'd basically come along. At one point, they will deploy the bomb, turn around and try and head back to Britain, knowing that it was a suicide mission. He got to a point where he started to ask questions as a commander. And he wasn't satisfied that the answers were stacking up in a logical nor a meaningfully solution-based way. And he thought, I'm out of this madness. He reached this tipping point. It was fascinating in the interviews with Commander Robert Greene to actually see the point in which he relayed when his mind and his views changed. He ended up marrying Kate Hughes, who in New Zealand is one of the pioneers of the anti-nuclear movement here in New Zealand and significantly recognised at the UN level. So it's an interesting little thing. I just wanted to add in there because it sounds the way you're talking is this what is we know from history is Oppenheimer, the father of the nuclear weapon, as opposed to Sir Ernest Rutherford, who was a New Zealander who was the first academic to theoretically split the atom, right? Well, he actually applied it and split the atom. But we're talking Oppenheimer is looked at as this is the guy that has created this fearsome weapon that the world has been struggling to deal with ever since. So you're just giving a little bit of an insight as to what happened in his own thinking at that point. Back to you, Paul.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little more further down about how those who know the best about what happens when nuclear weapons go off oftentimes become moderates. They're not hawkish about the use of these weapons because they know what they do. Oftentimes, it's non-nuclear savvy people who are the most prone to wanting to use them. And again, we'll return to this theme in a second. Anyway, to conclude the conversation about the Manhattan Project. So Woolstetter in the late 70s is telling myself and other grad students about how this went down. And unfortunately, Oppenheimer and Teller fell out over it because Teller and Woolstetter, as Teller's protege, were hawks. And they wanted to build a hydrogen bomb, which was more efficient than the bombs used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that eventuated in the 1950s. The nuclear crowd moved to hydrogen weapons at that point. And that, it's a pity because Oppenheimer was ostracized. He was accused of being a communist, all these sort of things. Teller went back to the University of Chicago and then got Woolstetter a job in the Department of Political Science. Woolstetter had been trained as an economist way back when. But anyway, wound up in the political science department, and that's why I went there, because of him and then the two theorists, international relations theorists that were there at the time. The last thing that Woolstetter said, which I found very interesting, was he said, when in 1944-45, we estimated that there was about 60 kilos of uranium in the entire world. So U-232, right? Base uranium in the soil. We thought there were about 60 kilos in the world. Once the bomb went off, the race was on to find, raw U-232, and we discovered that there were millions of tons of raw uranium available. It's that once it becomes a prized commodity, then all of a sudden you start discovering the amount that's there. I would draw the parallel with lithium. Lithium, 20 years ago, no one cared about the salt flats of Bolivia or mining in Western Australia for lithium. Now it is the fastest growing mining sector, and they have found tons of lithium, tons of cobalt. That's the new precious metal that everybody's looking for. So it was an interesting economics lesson that no one cared about uranium until a bomb went off, and then the race was on. Now, what's interesting about this, I think, is that especially after the Soviet Union got the bomb in 1948, then there was a real preoccupation on the part, not just of the United States, and perhaps the Soviets at the time, but of the world community, that the genie was out of the bottle. And so there was a very strong push throughout the 1950s to engage in nuclear arms control, figure out some way to limit the expansion of countries that have nuclear weapons, and then the types of weapons that could be deployed. And among other things, it eventually resulted in the banning of atmospheric testing, the last of which, of course, we're well aware of because of the French tests in French Polynesia. Those were the last of the atmospheric tests, and are part of New Zealand identity because of our resistance to it back in the day. And again, you know a lot more about that than I do. What's interesting is that in the 1960s and 70s, a number of arms control agreements were agreed to, both multinational as well as binational. The biggest of the multinational ones was the 1970 Non-Proliferation Treaty, which now has 195 signatories. The trouble is that has not prevented countries since then from becoming nuclear, India and Pakistan in particular. But it's well known that Israel has nuclear weapons. It is well known that South Africa, under the apartheid regime, conducted at least one nuclear test in the deep South Atlantic. And so it's held together pretty well, but it hasn't been, hermetic or
Mm.
inviolate.
So is it
In the,
fit for purpose in this day and age, do you think?
well, we're going to come around to that because I think
Mm.
it can be, but obviously we're going to have to modify in light of technological advances and the like. Now, but because again, the UK has nuclear weapons, France does. China, by that time, had developed, by the late 60s, had developed a crude, but nevertheless nuclear weapons capability. Um, the the urge to get some sort of arms control agreements in place really started to develop momentum. And so in the 1980s, after lots of negotiation, we had the SALT 1 and 2 agreements between the United States and Russia, which basically paused strategic nuclear weapons development. So the big guys. And then the second one, SALT 2, fixed the numbers of what was there. Numbers in terms of the warheads on the top, the platforms, so the launchers, but also the subs and the airplanes that can deliver them. And to their credit, Reagan negotiated. I think in the beginning was with Brezhnev, but concluded the second deal with Gorbachev. In the 1990s, that was replaced by the START agreement, which was an updated version. And what was good about that, see, they're making progress. But remember, this is bilateral. China is not covered. The UK is not covered. France is not covered. Pakistan and India are not covered. But in the START agreements in the 90s, the START agreement in the 90s, the decision was made to limit the total amount of warheads, I believe, to 1,550, and the total amount of launchers, platforms, to 550 of these big boomer types. And that held. That actually held. And in order to make it hold, you have to realize they do something on the order of 10 to 12 inspections a year, mutual inspections. And just as an anecdote underneath an anecdote, if you ever go to Tucson, Arizona, to their Air and Space Museum, the largest air force outside of most big powers is in what they call the Boneyard in Tucson, which is retired U.S. military aircraft. It's incredible. It's an incredible sight to see. They got planes that other countries would drool over, and they're all just sitting mothballed in the desert, waiting to be used in a future contingency. But they're now, a lot of them are museum pieces. Right next door to it is an Air and Space Museum that is worth going to if you're an aviation guy. But in that museum, there is a B 52 bomber. And in fact, there's more than one. And what they've done to it is it's been cut in half. One of them was cut in half. The other one has a huge cut in the roof. And that's so that the Russian satellites, when they go over, can see that this delivery vehicle has been disabled, right? So they're in reducing the amount of platforms. That's the sort of stuff they did. They said, look, you guys are welcome to come over and photograph our, nuclear aircraft fleet because we're cutting them in half. Because airplanes now are pretty obsolescent for the delivery of strategic nuclear weapons. They're superfluous. That's done by submarines and silo-based missiles. So, but the interesting thing is START 1 did in fact cap the amount of warheads and the amount of delivery vehicles. Now, the megatonnage, the throw weights, not that I want to get into the technical terms, but the size of the blast, that was not limited. The Soviets have always been into overkill. The Americans were more into, no, we want a precision. So that was left for each country to use its competitive advantage. START was renewed in 2010. It's called the New START, but here's where the bad news starts coming. In February of this year, 2023, the Russians withdrew from New START. They said, we've had enough. We're suspending our compliance. No more US inspectors, and we're going to do what we need to do. Okay, this year. Now, that was not done in isolation. And of course, the United States, as soon as they suspended participation in New START, the US said, fine, we're going to do the same, right? We're going to go back to the Cold War and outcompete you when it comes to nukes. And that's exactly what's going on. I mean, the American nuclear program has been revitalized as a result of this. Now, unfortunately, that didn't occur in a vacuum. There is such a thing as the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Agreement, or the INF as it's called. And that was to limit the amount of weapons, nuclear weapons, of a theater or tactical level. Again, those between 550 kilometers and 1,500 kilometers of reach, that held, excuse me, until 2019. And there were, they do it like in 3-year increments. So every 3 years they'd renew it. They try to lower the numbers. And that was successful during that time. What do you know? In 2019, the US, citing Russian violations, Trump, withdraws. Now, not entirely, but suspends its participation. And so the Russians say, fine, we're going to do the same. So we no longer have an intermediate range missile, weapons control agreement. It's been suspended.
And just for context, Simon Hughes has just put I don't mean it to take down a tangent here, but he's put just a clarification question here. I'll bring up the military. Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons to guarantee their independence in the early 1990s. Paul, can you talk to that? It's under the Yeltsin period, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the I forget, it's the 1994. I don't want to say Budapest Agreement because I think that I may have that wrong. But basically, what happened is this: in exchange for security guarantees, pardon me. Well, back up. The Russians had a considerable number of their nuclear weapons, both tactical and strategic, in the Ukraine during the days of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell, there was a lot of uncertainty about whose hands those weapons were going to fall into because, quite frankly, the Yeltsin regime was in chaos. And the Ukrainians, let's just say they were not the most reliable people when it comes to handling these nukes. So there was a deal struck between the US and the Russians that the Russians could come in and take out their missiles. It was their missiles, their artillery shells, and remove them back to Russia. The U.S. sent in a bunch of inspectors. They dismantled what was left in terms of maintenance facilities, and so that there was no nuclear weapons infrastructure left in the Ukraine. Right,
the Russians with the new Ukraine at that time too, they were very well aware of the dangers of all sorts of nuclear issues. In the wake of Chernobyl, for example,
exactly
those issues. So there was political context to being, we don't want them here anyway.
Exactly. And so there was even a nuclear strike force made up of physicists and then special operations guys, because the nature of these materials were so sensitive. They were afraid that they were going to fall into the hands of organized crime. That this could be a big problem. So
yeah, at the time there was talk about a dirty suitcase, being able to be travelled in the luggage of aircraft, taken into New York or anywhere like that, and then set off. That was the fear of the day, wasn't it?
Yeah, that among many other things. Now, in exchange, Russia guaranteed Ukrainian independence. It said, let us take our stuff. No, we don't want you joining NATO, but right now the most important thing is let us take our stuff and we'll leave you alone. So that was that. And thankfully, one might say there's no nukes in the Ukraine on both sides. I don't think the Russians have brought nukes into the Ukraine yet, but we shall see. Now, that START agreement, turned into the new START agreement in 2010. But as I just said, the Russians withdrew from it in February of this year, and so the Americans did likewise. So we don't have a strategic nuclear agreement covering the US and Russia. China, India, Pakistan, England, France, recognized nuclear powers. They're not covered by any agreement. They can build as many as they want. The French and the British are strongly committed to that deterrence theory that says we just need a few nukes to deter enemies from going after us. So we're not going to be big on thousands of weapons. The British, in particular, their nuclear arsenal is basically in their submarines. They don't have land-based nukes. Let's face it, their landmass is way too small to invite a strike. And the French are being coy, but they're mostly submarine-based as well. And again, the idea is don't attack us, we won't nuke you. I mean, they're that old-fashioned deterrence. To show you all the connection, Woolstetter wrote two books in the 60s and early 70s that I happen to have read quite a bit. The first one was The Delicate Balance of Terror, which is about MAD, right? It was the idea is this is the bad. So
That's
he
mutually assured destruction for those who are
right,
not sure what that can mean.
exactly. See, I'm so used to the terms, but it was Albert Woolstetter, who talked about that out of mutual assured destruction, you lived in a delicate balance of terror, keeping each other terrorized in order to not start a war. He later wrote, once other countries got nuclear weapons, he wrote a book called Living Life in a Nuclear Armed Crowd. And it was sort of the logic. Remember, I said Woolstetter was a hawk. It reminded me of the cowboy logic that I used to listen to when I lived down in southeastern Arizona. Again, I lived out on ranches out there for a period of time. And I won't get into the full story, but anyway, I was sitting in a cowboy bar, and I look around, and there's all these guys are armed. Everybody's got a pistol except me. And I say to the bartender lady, heavily tattooed woman with a cowboy hat, and I say, "Hey, does it ever make you nervous to see all these rubes of drinking and of fighting and everything?" And she goes, when they're all armed, and she goes, "Son, an armed crowd is a polite crowd." And so, in a weird way, Woolstetter's analogy, I guess you'd call it, it was a cowboy analogy. Well, we're not living in those days anymore. And what's happened is we no longer have an intermediate range nuclear missile agreement. We no longer have a strategic agreement. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty has been violated not by the majority of the 195 signatories, but by a significant minority. And what's happened that makes this, I think, worse than 1945 or worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis, hence, the Doomsday Clock being set at 90 seconds to midnight, is that the technologies to test nuclear weapons are now all computerized, are driven by artificial intelligence.
So they're
You
under
don't
the
have,
radar. So this is one of the things,
yes,
with the non-proliferation treaty, the concerns here is things like when Trump's president, and he blurts out, obviously, information of great strategic but also security interests that had been classified, that you wouldn't believe the weapons we've got now is the kind of thing he was doing, it would incinerate you in seconds, and this type of thing. So it puts the focus on to the non-proliferation treaty, doesn't it? And what on earth has been developed here under the radar without anyone knowing, that's obviously reached the presidential level, even with a president like Donald Trump, to the point where it's ready to go. So can you speak to those? Is there an intimate connection between what he was talking about and the advancement of weapons of global destruction, basically, is what he was hinting towards, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Well, I think that as you know, we well know, technology is outstripping the rules and norms governing enforcement of treaties. I'll give you an example. The people who seem to know the most about the Iranian nuclear weapons program are the Israelis. That's outside of the confines of the NPT, right? They're doing old fashioned spying to figure out what's up. Why? Because the International Atomic Energy Agency, which does inspections on nuclear sites, they're back in the Cold War days. They're looking for centrifuges, they're looking for accelerators. You don't need to have them physically present to run modeling on advanced computers about how things are going to go down in sequence once you start a chain reaction in a confined space. Remember, the hardest step in any nuclear weapons program is miniaturizing and getting the nuclear device into the nose cone of a missile. That is by far. I talked, a year or so ago about the use of laser triggers. See, I mean, just to hark back, Hiroshima, they put high explosives around a nuclear core, sufficient of them to crack the core, and then you had, the chain reaction, the big boom. Now they're not putting high explosives next to any core because they're sitting on, the cone of a cruise missile. Back in the day, I've been out of that business for a while, but they were using laser triggers, right? Just a laser right into the heart of the core. Boom. Who knows what they're doing now? But the Israelis understand that the IAEA cannot stop Iran from developing the technological capability. And so the Israelis are doing what they're doing. They're assassinating Iranian physicists. They're disrupting using computer means, the various computers used for Iranian modeling. I mean, this is very serious game being played between these two countries. But notice I said between two countries.
What's interesting also in that is that the Israelis seem to not believe in deterrence, that they do not admit to their nuclear arsenals. They basically push the envelope in allowing the innuendo to be there, and the belief that they exist to an area that is, to a degree that is fearsome. So that to me is an interesting element relating to. So they'd rather than rely on deterrence, they are deconstructing the abilities of their opponents to be able to get there.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. I'm thinking, they may be coy about whether they do or they don't. Everybody knows that they have nuclear weapons. And I think that limits what the Iranians want to do. The Iranians can talk fierce about wiping Israel off the face of the map. They're not going to try that. That would be a bad idea. But both sides are jockeying for position. My point is that international norms have left the scene. And these two countries are now doing what they got to do, given their rivalries, when it comes to the nuclear.
I mean, we've talked about this in general, so I won't labour the point too much. But when you've got a person that was in charge of the White House under, Donald Trump, we're talking about here, the fear that this kind of guy, that kind of personality, will not rationalise the seriousness of whether or not to go with a strike in such ways. And when you've got authoritarian leaders around the world that in some parts have similar kind of personalities that are looking at it in a different way than what those individuals like Gorbachev and Reagan and others did when they were entering into treaties, then we've got a whole different kettle of fish, haven't we? And I think the whole idea of this whole being aware of the opponent and the opponent being aware of you type of idea is only premised on reasonably minded outcomes or considerations. And beyond that is a situation of instability of which you're painting a very strong picture here. So I just wanted to put it in how I am interpreting what you're saying into the context of 2021 and going forward in the immediate term. So back to you, Paul, on that.
Yeah, no, you're a very good point. I mean, what you're talking about is now the discarded theory of mirrored rationality. Your
Mm.
opponent is as rational as you. That's not so much the case. And we've talked a lot about the international system being in transition. And now we have an authoritarian axis against a liberal democratic axis. It's not entirely sure that they share the same rationality. And this gets me back to the point that we no longer have any binding international nuclear proliferation or arms reduction agreements. But moreover, we have a number of states that have used the absence of binding multinational protocols with these new technologies available to them to expand their nuclear capabilities. I mean, it's argued generally that the size of the Indian and Pakistani nuclear arsenals are determined by the size of the Indian and Pakistani arsenals. They don't look at anyone else. They just look at each other and say, well, if this guy's got 20, I need 21. I mean, those sort of things. The Chinese, of course, are the greatest example of a country that has decided to go for it. They're not bound by the intermediate range treaties, now, of course, suspended. They are not bound by any strategic nuclear weapons control protocol at all. And so they're expanding mostly their land based silo fleet. And to the point that they could well supersede not only Russia, not only the United States, but the two combined when it comes to strategic delivery vehicles within the next decade. And if you recall that a lot of the warheads are, there's more than one warhead in the nose cone. That's the so-called maneuverable and multiple reentry vehicles. The proliferation problem is quite obvious. To which all of this we can add the violations, how could I put it? Infrequent but regular violations of the Chemical and Biological Weapons Convention. The hard fact is that, and you mentioned it in the intro, we saw the use of chemical weapons in Syria, and they got away with it. Lest the West think that they're so precious, we have seen the use of white phosphorus and cluster munitions, both supposedly banned, in Iraq
And
by
before that, the depleted uranium becoming common usage in the Gulf War and in Iraq and in all of these other theatres. And
right.
Fallujah of the white phosphorus, yeah.
Yeah, these are all weapons that have there's conventions against their use, and that simply doesn't stop anybody from using them. I think there is more self-restraint when it comes to biological weapons. I think that even chemical weapons you can target. This isn't the mustard gas of World War One. Biological weapons, you don't know where that's going to go. The pathogens can, blow back onto the delivering side just as much as it applies to the targeted population. So adherence to that convention is better, but again, it's not universal. And so we get examples repeatedly of militaries that either for expediency purposes or out of desperation are using supposedly banned weapons. And I won't even get into the use of weapons against your own population, like is currently occurring in Myanmar, where they're using banned weapons against the Rohingya and other minority populations
And,
because
and, all, and also the civilian opposition within their own country, yeah.
yeah. I mean, the Tamanda simply do not care about weapons conventions and whatnot, nor the human rights of their own people in order to preserve their dictatorship. So uh, I won't say I despair, but I would say that I agree with the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. They're just focused on nukes. But I'm
Mm.
thinking this world time, this moment right now, when it comes to the control of weapons of mass destruction is probably as fraught as any time since 1945. And the reason for this, the bottom line, is we don't have enforcement capability. We don't have multinational enforcement capability. People
Okay,
get
just
away
on
with.
that. Yeah, they get away with it. So just on that, this is the point of, in my view, of this episode. We've got a very good idea of what we're facing right at this particular time. What needs to happen? And this is the tricky, the horrid, the fearsome elements of this whole debate, really, is what needs to happen for global leaders and the world itself to get to a tipping point where it thinks we have just scared ourselves to the point where we know there's no going back. What do we need to do to find a solution? So, Paul, the conditions that preempt any particular solutions that you can identify here. And I just wanted to jump in at that point because I think you're just starting to show the weather vane in that direction.
Yeah, that's a tough nut to crack. I guess I'd start with this because just to finish, again, tie up something that we started with early in the show. At the end of the day, the decision to use weapons of mass destruction is a political one, not a military one. And in the moments before we started the show, you and I were talking about the purges that are going on in the Chinese leadership. You know, they've removed the foreign minister. You were pointing out that they've removed the top commanders of the rocket forces in China. Of course, the rocket forces are nuclear, and that goes to, perhaps President Xi is asserting his political control, not only over the foreign ministry, but also over the nuclear components of his defense forces. Perhaps because both the foreign ministry and these two generals in particular were rather moderate when it came to using the military for the pursuit of political ends. As you mentioned, and I'll reiterate because I agree with you, it appears to be that those who know most about nuclear weapons are reluctant to use them. I know that in my experience with people in the Air Force and the Navy in the United States who handled nukes, they were pretty moderate when it came to using them. They were like, as you said in our private conversation, they got families. They got their kids should have futures, and so perhaps President Xi is seeing that he's not getting people to come along with his assertive military diplomacy that could end in a nuclear exchange, even if tactical. Because, those military commanders understand the escalation problem. But President Xi has domestic economic problems and he's got other things going on. And he may think that taking a hard military line is a way to not only divert local attention or domestic attention from his domestic woes, but also to use as leverage against both their neighbors and then potential adversaries like the
Yeah, and
United
just
States.
just looking at that position you've pitched there, I suppose if she is an advocate of deterrence, he believes in the doctrine, then strengthening up the hawkish levels. And just at this point, we need to analyse more those that have replaced the ones that have been removed. But if it is that they're more hawkish, then it would suggest that he is sending signals to Western powers like the United States. There's also the other side that leading through to the end of 2022 and into the early months of 2023, that there was information that seemed to be suggesting that the military were not always speaking out publicly in the same way as what the political apparatus under Xi was, that there were at times more hawkish positions that the Chinese or the People's Republic of China's military were pushing when Xi, for example, was just edging back. Now, this was before he has been more assured of his immediate leadership and the length and tenure of that. So there's an analysis around that could probably do another episode in the least, and also is obviously, because of its importance, the study of many within government apparatus and academia around the world. So it is an interesting concept. Paul, I just wanted to add that part to it, that there is different ways of reading this. And if you take that point of view that Xi believes in deterrence, then it's most likely what you're saying is a signal to the West that don't mess with us over these types of issues.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean, he could just be simply saying we're going to firm up our nuclear retaliatory capabilities, and then there's no question that you will not attack us, in any essential area, because of the response you will certainly be delivered. And that would be rational. I mean, that's the thing. That would not be entirely political. That would be rational for someone who believes in that type of deterrence theory, right? Just again, strength through numbers, if you will. I think the important thing is you want to think about solution sets, and I urge listeners, if you get a chance, look up the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. I forget what the parent organization is. It's like the Association of Atomic Scientists, or something. But Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is an actual journal, uh, really good on these sort of issues. The trouble there is they offer a lot of solutions when it comes to renewing various arm control protocols, mostly in the nuclear realm. I mean, brilliant solutions, but they're all technical. And that's where, you and I differ from them, in that we accept Oppenheimer's premise that at the end of the day, the use of nukes is a political one, not a technical one or a military one. It's the political leadership that make the call. And so the solutions have to be, sure, technical at one level, but political, diplomatic at the most important level. And that, I'll tell you, I'm struggling. I've been trying to think of a way in which medium and small powers can make the difference. Going back to that
Yeah,
mini lateralism or microlateralism we talked about.
exactly. And that is something that one has to accept. And I mean, not us as individuals, but the world cumulatively, that a rules-based order is on it for multilateral at that type of level to be effective as a solution. So this is getting back to that conundrum that I'm talking about here and put to you just before, that when the world is not recognizing or respecting global order, global rules-based order, and perceiving it as Western biased, then what has to happen before we get to a point where the world's states, governments, countries once again say, we've seen the end and it doesn't look too pretty for any of us, so let's get back to the table and get things sorted?
Well, I may be rather, blinkered in my thought about this, but I think, okay, this is going to be a multi-stage process. And again, I'm thinking as I'm speaking. The Russians have to lose in Ukraine. Okay, they got to back into Russia. Why? Because then you can talk about expanding the New START talks and say, you know what, as one of your security guarantees, how about we bring in the People's Republic? How about we bring in France and the UK and the US and talk about reducing everybody's strategic inventory? All right, that's what we're offering you for getting out of the Ukraine. Let's all lower the temperature when it comes to strategic nukes. And in parallel, or perhaps as a result of that, then let's talk about the intermediate range nukes. And everybody's going to be left with something, but it's not going to get to the levels that, precipitate, an arms race where people decide the only defense is to go it alone and militarize the so-called security dilemma, right? You see them doing it, so you do it, and now you got the spiral. That might be a solution to it. I just think that Ukraine is now the big test because the Russians may or may not use nukes. So I've now moved into, I used to say, there's no way they're going to use them.
Although
They
on a
know,
tactical level, you were kind of not
Yeah,
sure. You're kind of thinking, they may, if things escalate, they may consider that in the field. Then there's the issue of just basic environmental impacts, isn't it? From the point of view of tactical nukes were developed largely, in my understanding, by Western NATO interests in the Great Cold War, looking toward the east, the Great Russian Plain, knowing that if tactical nukes were used in any land theatre of hostilities, that generally the wind would blow the radioactive components of the consequence of using those weapons back on the enemy. It's not the case in Russia's case, is it? That the flow of air, wind, generally predicted weather patterns would send tactical nuke and all that fallout back over its own troops should it deploy in those narrow theatres of the Donbass. So that in a basic sense is what we're talking about here. But then it comes to the question of, well, those making calling the shots on such things, are they prepared to actually risk that type of danger to their own? But
yeah.
we
Well,
don't know the
the
answers
Russian,
of that.
yeah. I mean, it all has to do whether you do air bursts or ground bursts and the size of the warhead. I mean, if you put an artillery shell into the ground to wipe out Ukrainian armored formations, the radioactive cloud is going to be relatively, small, and will blow back. And we have to look at the Russian style of war, which again we've talked about. They're doing scorched earth. They don't have much of a regard for their own soldiers. I mean, the soldiers are not equipped with, the breathing apparatus and the anti-radioactive gear, which is one of two things. It's an indication that they don't plan on using nukes, or two, they don't care about their own soldiers. But it is coming back their way in the event of an atmospheric burst, anything sizable. But let's be honest, the eastern Ukraine is a wasteland. I mean, no crops are going to be grown there, for any foreseeable future. So adding radioactive debris on top of it is not the Russians' concern. And again, I'm harping on this, but the military commanders may say, hey, this is all coming back at us. But it's the political leadership in Moscow that, as they may say, in desperation, let's go for it. Let's just do that. And that's where Medvedev's comments were a bit alarming, because he may have misspoke about strategic and tactical. But I'm like, I'm moving from now, they're not going to do this. They know the escalation potential, to now, they could do this under certain circumstances. And then we don't know, I mean, then, you open that can of worms. So what I'd
Yeah.
say is that,
So
go ahead.
I'm just saying on that point before we move off it. Barbara Thomas is right on the button with current events here. She says, I am concerned, given recent developments, that Belarus may become a proxy for Russia to use nuclear weapons. The Wagner troops, for example, invading Polish airspace, and the sighting of weapons all in Belarus. So there's a couple of things there. Obviously many are watching what Wagner is doing on the borders around Poland. It seems to be one of two things, one or maybe both, putting pressure on the West and once again putting a bit of fear and loathing into the equations on that Polish border, but also from the point of view of Russia of strengthening up its enclave to its own territories that are landlocked and wrapped around by Western interests. So it may be that. Also, this question here from Barbara as well, what would the West do if Belarus used nuclear weapons? And she would mean of technical or any type, I would say, Paul, because it's most likely tactical, that would be moved into Belarus for the reasons of which you've been talking about. I'll put it back to you now.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Barbara, for that. So the weapons that have been introduced into the Belarus are those very intermediate range nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons that we've talked about before. And interesting about that is that when the INF was signed, the U.S. withdrew its tactical and theater nukes from Western Europe. The Russians withdrew their tactical and theater nukes from all the stands. So Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all those former Soviet republics, took them out of there. They have now reintroduced these weapons into Belarus. That to me is the most alarming development. But again, that treaty did not cover the deployment of the weapons. Now, the good news is control of Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus is in Russian hands. It's not in Lukashenko's hands. And, I mean, I guess that's open to debate. Is Lukashenko a better bet when it comes to nukes than Putin? You know?
I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't subscribe to that view.
I mean, I'm thinking,
it-
he's got skin in the game, but on the other hand, he's got his own interests. The
mm,
Wagnerites, I mean, I forget the name of the gap that connects Kaliningrad to Belarus.
mm.
It's in between Poland and, anyway, there's a strip of land that the Wagnerites,
Lithuania.
yeah,
Look up in the Baltics regions.
yeah, and I'm not sure what the Wagnerites are interested in doing because the Poles are itching for a fight. I mean, the Poles are incredibly hawkish on getting into the mix. And they don't care if it's Belarus or the Russians. I mean, the Poles are itching for a fight because, apparently the depth of their historical grievances against the Soviets is way deeper than I could have imagined. So I actually think the West has got a problem in trying to keep the Poles calm down because they're going to look at any provocation as a reason to go over and smack certainly Belarus because they're the weaker link in this chain. But to me, the deployment of tactical theater nukes in Belarus is, symptomatic of the norms erosion that I've been speaking about during the show. And who knows what back channels are going into, Lukashenko's inner circle. But, you think someone would say to him, by the way, if any nuke comes out of Belarusian territory, you guys are going to be turned into glass. Now, that's not actually how things happen, but say to him, we don't care if the Russians are controlling the trigger. It came out of your territory, and so you're fair game. I mean, you just opened it up, and that's why picking a fight with a NATO member like Poland or Lithuania uh, would be near
Yeah.
suicidal.
You know what worries
Yeah,
me on that whole thing? That Wagner group up there, and we still need to see a lot more happen before we know exactly what the deal is between the Kremlin and the Wagner organization. But
well,
what
maybe they
worries
split.
me is on the surface of it is that as a private military company and it goes across the borders and the states involved can say, hey, we didn't have anything to do with this. This is private interests that have done that. And that to
They
me is the
can, but
concerning area.
yeah, but that's a fig leaf. I mean, it's think of it this way. Not that we want to repeat the episode, but the Taliban said, "Hey, we had nothing to do with 9/11, right? We were just good hosts for these Al Qaeda people. We didn't know what they were, setting up to do, and so don't blame us." Well, if Belarus wants to play that game and say, "Hey, these are private military guys. We don't know what they're up to," I don't think anyone's going to buy it. And what's interesting is the Wagner presence in Belarus tells us that a deal was struck uh, between Prigozhin and Putin at
Yeah.
some level. That deal has been done. Prigozhin, is not a dead man walking, at least for the foreseeable future, because again, his utility remains the same, even though the theater has changed. Maybe the Wagnerites are there for defensive purposes to plug a gap because they think the Poles are going to try to come that way. I think that's ridiculous, but I'm not, thinking of them or thinking like them. The issue is, we have to get back to thinking, and I do think that resolving this war on terms that are favorable to Ukraine is our best hope for reestablishing the rule of law and the reinforcement of norms regarding potential weapons of mass destruction, both nuclear and non nuclear. And the question for me, again, perhaps because now I'm a long time resident citizen of a small country is where can medium-sized and small countries come into the fray? Because the big players, it's right now it's all about might makes right. They see the world in Hobbesian terms. We're just going to go out and get some, and we're going to do it because of our power disparities in our favor. But what about the rest of us? Where the rule of law is actually our best security guarantee.
Mm.
All this norm erosion around us makes us insecure.
Very
And I
edgy.
remember a conversation you and I had a while back. I mean, again, we've had so many interesting ones where we were talking about New Zealand, trying to be an honest broker, whatever, but saying to the Chinese, look, you're making us nervous. Your bellicose activities in the East and South China Seas, the saber rattling against Taiwan, you're making us nervous. Now you got some security deal with the Solomons. Sorry, but we're like looking for protection elsewhere, and it shouldn't be like that. And interestingly, a fellow whose work I respect here in New Zealand, a guy by the
White.
name of Ruben
Yeah, I
Ruben
was going to
Stepp.
bring up. Yeah, very good. The Waikato academic who has written a
Yeah,
piece that has been republished in the New Zealand Herald. Yeah.
yeah. He and I talked about that piece before he published it. Again, we get along. I respect his work. He's a very good scholar, and so we backed and forth with some of the drafts. And I think he makes a very good point. I was telling him about issue linkage, right? Trade and security, which again, you and I have covered in great length. And he was interesting because, and again, that's why it's nice to deal with smart people. He had a twist on it. In other words, I was thinking in traditional terms, right? You trade with your security partners, West is West, East is East. And he's like, no, we have to convince the Chinese that yes, we'll continue to trade, but we need to establish some security relationships that are mutually beneficial, are not competitive the way everything is set up now. And that was the point of his op-ed was we need to link, I think he used the phrase issue linkage, our trade and our security interests in whichever way we can. And what's interesting is that goes to the heart of yet another thing we've talked about, which is the introduction of Maori and Pacific values in New Zealand foreign policy to
Mm.
focus on areas of agreement first, areas of consensus, before you get into the areas of contention or disagreement. So Reuben wrote, a very nice piece. And I thought, this is good. Tell the Chinese it's in your interest to offer us security guarantees if you want us to remain independent when it comes to the big foreign policy decisions of the current time. Now, I don't know if the Chinese will buy that, but it's got to be that creative thinking. It's got to be not the big powers on their own because they're too locked in now to these competitive
Mm.
mindsets, and more for the medium and small countries to say, without the norms and in the current, period of transition slash contention, things are dangerous and we're going to get trampled. You guys are a bunch of elephants and we're the mice. We need to go back. I would use the UN, but maybe this is a move to, or a reason to move for Security Council reform. I mean, there's
Absolutely.
many areas to go at, but in the end, I think that the the single most important thing to get us back on track on the road to, if not disarmament, the control and non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, is for the Russians, if not to be defeated, to be forced to sue for peace and withdraw from their reckless venture in the Ukraine.
Yeah, and I'm sure many in Russia would agree with that, meaning the efforts of Russian leadership to actually explore the ideals of peace. And that's what we're picking
Mm,
up all the
mm,
time from them. So on that, thanks, Paul. Thanks for wrapping that up. Thanks for taking us through, which is obviously one of the biggest challenges of our time.
mm.
And thank you to those who have been on the question and comment areas while we've been recording this live, particular Simon Hughes, Barbara Thomas and others. Thank you for your contribution. I look forward to welcoming you all back on Paul's behalf again, this time in 2 weeks' time, to explore another big and meaningful issue. And to those who are listening to it on demand, once again, we will be back with a fresh episode on Wednesday, United States Eastern Standard Time around 8 p.m. In 2 weeks' time, and also that equates to Thursday on this side of the globe at midday in New Zealand. I look forward to your company then. Until then, ka kite anō. Take care out there. Goodbye.